Visually, Dune is in a league of its own when it comes to sci-fi films. When I mention sci-fi, what probably comes to mind are things like lens flares, lasers, strongly lit interiors, but what you're probably not thinking of is beautiful naturalistic cinematography, motivated realistic lighting, and photorealism outweighing the importance of the visual effects pieces. Striking a balance between realism and aesthetics is a major theme in the success of Dune's visual separation from most other sci-fi and epic movies. While films in the genre are really fun to watch and usually have some cool visual effects, in my opinion, most of them tend to have this overproduced manufactured quality about them, visually at least, which makes Dune all the more refreshing. And that's not to say Dune doesn't have the big battles and the awesome visual effects set pieces. I mean, there's a giant sandworm and giant ships and space travel, but being in the sci-fi genre and having amazing cinematography and direction don't need to be mutually exclusive, and director Denis Villeneuve is no novice at achieving that, having also directed Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, two other sci-fi films which have high value placed on the quality of cinematography. So what is it about Dune that helps it stand out so much in the sea of crisp, shiny sci-fi films? Well, for starters, it's the opposite of crisp and shiny. It's soft and hazy. Camera work, lighting, and visual effects all come together to give us something that feels real and immersive. We don't have physics-defying cameras giving us impossible shots, we don't have scenes blasted with lights so that everything is always easy to see, and we don't have visual effects taking precedence over the story beats and mood. And I'll clarify that point more in a sec. Touching on the camera work first, in an interview, cinematographer Fraser said that their approach was very much to be with Paul, to be at his height, in his head, and to see the world through his eyes. And that alone grounds the film figuratively and literally. The only time we really get any sort of flying camera is when Paul is in an ornithopter himself, flying around. And like I said earlier, a lot of sci-fi and action films like to use sweeping huge camera moves to show just how cool something is, but because we know cameras don't really move that way in reality, whether consciously or not, it makes the movie feel less authentic. By restraining the camera work to movements that a human could actually film, what we're seeing gains credibility even if we have to sacrifice an awesome looking shot, and Dune thankfully goes down that route. Another result of keeping the camera at Paul's height is really showing the sense of scale in the best possible way. It's another thing Dune is really great at. Everything big actually feels big. If we take a look at something like the Atreides ship, for example, from a flying camera's perspective, it's really hard to figure out scale. It can be huge or a toy for all we know. So one of the first techniques to illustrate scale properly is to give us scale reference. Things that we're familiar with like trees, cars, or best of all, other people. So if we go ahead and drop some people into the scene, we're beginning to move more towards illustrating the true scale. And this is actually where a lot of films tend to stop. In an effort to clearly show the audience what the object or structure is, they want to try to keep it all in shot, which doesn't quite solidify just how massive it is. The next step, and the step that Dune often takes, is sacrificing a full, clear view of what we're looking at to drop the camera way lower and closer to the object. Now we don't just have tiny humans for scale somewhere in the shot, but we're right there at eye level seeing these massive structures up close, and oftentimes not even being able to see the whole thing in frame. And we can only assume these ship models are highly detailed, but them feeling massive while seeing less of them is more important than them being fully in view but not feeling as large. Which touches a bit on the topic of how in Dune, the visual effects take a backseat to mood and immersion, and that's amazing. What I mean by that is just Denis has great visual effects studios working on the film, and there are tons of wow moments where the visual effects can shine, but when he needs to, he's not afraid to sacrifice the clarity of shots for the sake of realism or mood. There's a lot of moments where heavy rain or sand obscures most of the CG, and having the confidence to not show off set pieces in favor of either crafting the mood he wants or emulating true photoreal footage is not something typical of the genre. I mean, this whole scene where we meet the Bene Gesserit for the first time is really cool, super unsettling, can barely see a thing. Possibly my favorite example though is at the end of the film. There's a scene where Paul and Jessica are running away from a giant sandworm, desperately trying to get to some rocks where the worm can't get to them. And I think this scene really drives home Denis' priorities with the visual effects. It would be so easy, and in fact expected, that when they're running away, the camera cuts to an overhead so that we can see this massive sandworm gaining on them. It would look cool, almost certainly be a shot in the trailer, and I'm almost positive if someone else directed this scene, they would have gone for it. But instead, Denis stays with the characters in this suspenseful moment, letting the threat of the worm stay in the background of the frame, but still letting the fear of the characters take center stage. I think this just perfectly encapsulates a lot of what makes Dune so great, and what I meant earlier about how in the film, its impressive visual effects don't take precedence over the story beats and mood. They work together, and I feel like that's how it should be, but unfortunately, it's not something I see all the time. The lighting in Dune is another thing that completely separates it from most other films in the genre, and it can only really be described as naturalistic and authentic, with grounded photographic decisions seeming to lead the way instead of overlighting for the sake of visual clarity. That's a lot of words. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. A lot of the interior scenes in Dune are mainly lit by sunlight filtering in through an opening, so we get this nice hard direct light and then a softened bounce light filling in everything else. Usually when this is the case in films, to allow us to see both the bright outside and the characters inside, in the camera they expose for everything outside, which then makes indoors super dark, and to cheat that, they then light the scene even brighter inside so that both are visible. And this is exactly what I mean when I say Dune has naturalistic lighting. They do still use that technique, but very lightly, so the interior scenes are a lot darker than we're used to, but it feels way more authentic than the alternative. This commitment to lighting realistically also seeps into the visual effects involving light, where during this battle scene they made sure to make the rest of the scene darker as explosions went off, because that's how the camera would react if you're trying not to let the explosions blow out the highlights. It's basically just another example of our indoor-outdoor lighting example, but applied to visual effects, which is awesome attention to detail and commitment. Now, I wanted to talk a bunch more about the visual effects in Dune, but while researching for this video, I stumbled on Thomas Flight's video where he proceeded to smash it out of the park, and I'd rather not just recycle someone else's video and present it to you, so definitely give that a watch because it's pretty awesome. Well done, Thomas, but also know that I hate you for doing so well. That's gonna be it for this video. Usually at the end I do something for a no context poll where I let you vote on Twitter between a couple of options, giving you no context for what you're voting for, and then making something involving that that's also related to the tutorial and sticking it at the end of the video. But since this isn't a tutorial, sadly we're gonna have to skip this one. I know it's sad, but if you aren't already following me on Twitter, make sure you are so that you can catch the next video's poll. Now let me take a second to thank this video's sponsor, Skillshare. If you weren't aware, Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creators. They've got a ton of topics you can explore, but the ones that I'm personally drawn to are film and video, productivity, and creative writing. A class that I watched recently that I think you might enjoy is Outdoor Photography, See, Shoot, and Share the Beauty Around You by Min T. He focuses a lot on composition and finding interesting shots in the architecture everywhere around you, which easily carries over to shooting video as well. If that sounds interesting to you, then give his course on Skillshare a go. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, so you don't have to worry about ads, and they're constantly launching new premium classes for members so that you can stay focused and follow where your creativity takes you. If you're interested in joining, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today. Thanks, Skillshare.